Okay, it's 1:03. I was thinking we were going to begin at 1:05, but seeing that everyone is here, we can begin. So greetings everyone and welcome to a History Workshop webinar. Today our guest is Patrick Mangashe, who's going to present the armed struggle, mass mobilization and the internal underground, 1983 to 1990. So Patrick Mangashe holds a master's in history from the University of Fort Hare, and he's presently doing research for his PhD. He's a member of OHASA and a published author, and he has presented papers on aspects of South Africa's liberation, history, and politics at several conferences. So the paper which this presentation will be based upon is drawn from ongoing PhD work. So I hope all of you noticed the paper was circulated in the emails. It was a link there. So Patrick will present or outline his argument for 25 to 30 minutes, after which we'll open the discussion to the floor. So we are targeting to conduct this session within an hour. So we should aim to be done by 2:05. Of course, we can spill over to 10 past, but the aim is to be done by 2:05. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Tabiso, and greetings to all. The main thesis of this work is that the establishment of the United Democratic Front gave impetus to the ANC's armed struggle. And it further argues that after having had the armed struggle taking root in South Africa just after the formation of the UDF, the same armed struggle was halted in mid-stride as a result of the negotiation. My presentation is in 3 parts as befits the topic: the armed struggle, mass mobilization as symbolized by the United Democratic Front, and the armed struggle, organized actions of Mkondo Sizwe. I'm going to start off with the underground, as it gives a proper narrative form from the 70s. Then I'm going to get into the United Democratic Front, what it was, why is it that it was able to amass such numbers of people across class strata, geographic lines. Then I'm going to halt before I get into the conclusion to the UDF and get to the armed struggle. And I'm doing this so that we'll be able to achieve a kind of blending of the topic. The underground of the African National Congress of the 1980s, that functioned in the 1980s, can be traced from the early 60s to the 70s. During this process, where former members of the ANC who had served their sentences in prisons throughout South Africa, but mainly Robben Island, are being released because they've served their sentences. Other people who were previously banned and their bans are expiring, and they also are coming above board and are able to work. So this group is the group that I'm going to refer to as the underground. In the Transvaal, there are people like Joe Gabi, Albertina Sulu, people like John Kadimeng, Sam Doe. In Natal, there's people like Harry Gwala, Dorothy Nyembe. In the Eastern Cape, the border, Transkei, you have people like Joe Marty, people like Bunsen Fisher, Ivy Tsina, James Carty, Ezra Squela, and the others. In the Western Cape, you have people like Mountain Kumbela, Christmas Tinto, Mildred Lysia, Alpheus Ndude. In the Free State, so far, I could pick up only Caleb Mutsabi. Now, the people in the Transvaal would report to Swaziland and Botswana, those in Natal to Swaziland, those in the Western Cape to Lesotho and Botswana, those in Natal, mainly Swaziland. The Eastern Cape border, Transkei, would report to Lesotho and Swaziland, as well as the Free State to Lesotho. Those are contacts, ANC contacts. So these people inside who are, I would call them heads of these groups, would report to the ANC in the frontline states. At that time, in Swaziland, Thabo Mbeki is in Swaziland during the period that we're talking about. In Lesotho, there's Chris Hani, and other people like Fanele Mbali, Lihlono Lomloyi. In Botswana, Joe Kabi goes away, leaves the country. He is in Botswana at this time, and he also becomes then the president of the ANC in Botswana, and they link up with him. The task of this underground is to bring in new members into their fold. It is to knight, if I may use that, new, younger people into the principles, policies of the ANC. It is to show them the rules of the underground, how to work in the underground. Now, prime or part of the task of the underground is also, apart from increasing membership to themselves, but it is also to get into the above board, because the task of the underground mainly is to ensure that the ideas of the ANC, political thought of the ANC, is not lost. So they do this by ensuring that they get into above board organizations, influence above board organizations, including the establishment of above board organizations where none would have existed. Now, members of this underground, as they go on and work, clearly would need funding. This responsibility during this period falls on Dr. Bias Nodie. Dr. Bias Nodie becomes the main distributor of funds into the underground structures. Horst Kleinsmith at this moment is CEO of the Christian Network, of which Bias Nodie is head. He does this work of distribution of these funds. He gets under pressure and has to leave the country. Jessie Duarte comes in as PA to Bias Nodie. She does the same work. Jabu Ngwenya also is a courier of funds from Europe into South Africa. Orat van Heerden also is part of the network of Dr. Bias Nodie in the work that they're doing here. So one has mentioned that the work of the ANC underground would be seen in the role played by individuals belonging to these secret structures. Now, their work was not to survive as secret groups. This is not the work. The work is to ensure that the political thought of the ANC has an impact in above board organizations. This is going to be seen in the work that these different individuals do in the work of the formation of the United Democratic Front as the United Democratic Front goes on in its campaigns. But at this moment, I needed to go to the period that I regard as the period of the reawakening of political mass, above board mass action, because all had been quiet in 1976 and into the bannings in 1977. But now in 1979, a new period comes in, and this is seen by worker strikes, the fetters and monies worker strike in the Western Cape, then the red meat boycott. This 1979, 1980, and then in 1980, we see an outbreak of schools boycotts in the Western Cape. And from the Western Cape, it also goes on to the Transvaal. Some parts of the Transvaal respond to this, some parts of the Natal province respond to this. Then in 1981, there's yet another event, and that is the Wilson Roundtree strike in East London. It is led by a new union called SAU, the South African Allied Workers Union. A number of things happened during this strike, because as the employer dismisses the striking workers en masse, what the union does is, learning from the experiences of the 40s and Moonies and the red meat strikes, they immediately send ambassadors of their own, who are in this sense, in this case, shop stewards and ordinary workers. They send these ambassadors throughout the country to fraternal organizations to canvass their support in the strike. These largely respond. And so you have the main form of solidarity in this strike is the boycott of Wilson Roundtree products. And these other organizations and people that are canvassed by these ambassadors also develop an interest, a deeper interest in this Wilson Roundtree strike. And as the strike goes on in this, they also respond, a kind of habit develops of these activists throughout the region in the country at that moment, revisiting East London as a kind of main center, as where the site of this strike is. They're interested in learning, in having more insights into the strike and also how they can better their support for the working people. And as they come together from the different regions, the profile is young people who are new workers, others at university. And we're talking here about particularly people like Sigmund Fumadi, who just started being a worker, and people like Jackson Tembu, Confidence Mloko, Trevor Manuel, people that can refer to that are known. These are people, some of whom who come into East London, and they something that each of them say they recognized as they continued with these discussions was that the language they used was the same language. Their world political outlook seemed to be the same. And this was no surprise. It was because most of them, if not all, were proteges, were under the influence of the ANC underground that I just described, that was formed in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. Those older people are in touch with them. They read the same literature. They listen to Radio Freedom. So their language is the same, and they realize this. So here in this Wilson Roundtree strike, friendships are struck, connections are made. And as they go on back to their regions, these friendships are maintained. And we're talking now 81, and when 83 comes, we are already into the formation of the United Democratic Front. And the result of this work of the underground and the influence of the Wilson Roundtree strike in bringing them together has made a kind of advanced as the people who were otherwise in the underground, were taught in the underground, are now coming up as as a layer of leadership, but now in the above board, so that they are now able to identify each other across regions, and so that when the United Democratic Front's formation comes in, the committee that has the task of organizing in the regions is not actually at a loss as to whom to contact. That's already they know who the people are that are in the regions that are relevant, as the word was. Now we ordered into the formation of the United Democratic Front. The UDF, I would mention, has as a catalyst to its formation the New Deal, tricameral parliament on the one side and the Black local authorities on the other side. Black local authorities are strengthened. The influx control system is screwed in so as to ensure that no Black people that are unproductive would come into the Black labor, into the urban areas. Tricameral parliament is aimed at the colored and Indian population who otherwise react in a negative way to it, which is why the Indian and colored activists of the time are in the forefront in the formation of the United Democratic Front. That I'm talking about people like Kassim Saruji, Ali Musa, Sherif Karolas, Trevor Manuel, Pravin Gordhan, Alan Bosak, but there were others, of course, in this effort. Achikumed Betena Suru, Popomle, Federal Court, Mefin Rube, and others. The United Democratic Front had strengths that were, in one's opinion at least, new in the South African political scene, in the way in which they approached the task, the effort towards the destruction of apartheid. The first part is the United Democratic Front, as Valimosa says, was a front in the truest sense of the word. In other words, it was not a distinct political party. It had no classical branches. But the main thing was that its affiliates in themselves participated fully in the activities of the front. The main power in the UDF was its regions, from whence suggestions towards policy, towards campaigns would come. So each affiliate in the regions would have the right to, for instance, be to be represented in the regional structure. And that was irrespective of how large or small that affiliate would be. In turn, the regions would in turn have the right to send a minimum of 2 representatives up to the national structure. This ensured a completely democratic atmosphere, a feeling that affiliates themselves mattered most. And the second part is where the UDF ensures that it has the power, the ability to link the affiliates' local issues with the national broader struggle for national liberation. In other words, the main part becomes the people's daily struggles, the people's daily issues, what affects them daily. And it is easier for this to dawn on them that, but at the end, real change would come when we are able to influence the passing of laws wherein the national part comes in. Now, the UDF's campaigns are what I needed to talk about. And in these campaigns, one of the most important, in my opinion, is the first campaign, January 1984, the Million Signatures campaign. And in this, what is important, in my opinion, is the form in which this campaign takes. Batches of volunteers are recruited, trained, workshopped in methods of approaching the community and in how to answer questions and how to put UDF policy across, how to listen to the people. It is targeted at 1 million signatures. It doesn't make the 1 million signatures at the end, but what it achieves is when these volunteers go into the communities doing door-to-door campaigns, they're able to meet up with the people up front, and they're able to also identify talent in people who have interest and have the wherewithal of organization being built around them in their communities. And because these volunteers are locally based volunteers, there is a kind of continuation of organization here. The Million Signatures campaign, I think, stood out in as far as that strength is concerned, and so the UDF could build on, for instance, a 400,000 number, a big number, going on forward. They had signed on the petition. They were potential members, if not members already. UDF campaigns would go on to the anti-BLA drive, Black Local Authorities drive. The BLAs were unpopular, also because in the whole plan of them being given more power, the apartheid state did not reinforce that with financial budgets. Instead, the BLAs were to depend mainly on taxation. The people are already overtaxed. And so that's the higher rentals, and they were to effect evictions to defaulters, evictions of widows, which made them very unpopular. Other UDF campaigns would be from protest to challenge, which would be from describing a situation where they move from them being a protest movement into challenging the state. The freeing of all political prisoners, the Release Mandela campaign is part of this that has been going on. There was a Release Mandela committee that was part of the UDF too. And so the UDF would go on with these campaigns and ban the people's organizations. At any given moment, the UDF, between 1983 and 1990, the UDF had at its hands a campaign, or there would be multiple campaigns at the same time. So one can say that the UDF became a single movement, campaign, wave that went from its establishment to the time that it was disbanded, a single strong wave of a campaign that remarkably does achieve most, if not all, of its objectives, which are set in their declaration as the establishment of a non-racial, unitary, non-sexist, democratic South Africa. And with all of this talks to apartheid, non-racial, the answer to apartheid is non-racialism. To Bantustanization, it is a unitary South Africa. To sexism and the rest of that, democracy. UDF unites, apartheid divides is their slogan. I need us to pause here now, and in as far as the UDF is concerned, before I do the conclusion, to go on to the armed struggle. Up front, I need to say that the armed struggle has been a topic of interest to a number of parties. I would quote here Dr. Neil Barnard in his Secret War. He says the ANC's armed struggle was feeble and totally ineffective against the SADF, and that they failed to establish bases inside South Africa. General Hermann Stadler, in his interview with Howard Barrell in 1990, maintains that the ANC's armed struggle could not succeed without their their combatants had received good training outside the country. And this was because they were Black people and had no experience in war. Dale McKinley, in his ANC and the Liberation Struggle, assessed that the ANC failed to integrate the armed struggle with mass struggle. Let us come back to these arguments at a later stage just now. I just needed to make a comparison, first and foremost, and do, I have a list here from, my source is the Institute for Strategic Studies. From 1976 to 1982, period of 6 years, reported MK operations inside South Africa were 156. In 1984 alone, there were 44. In 1985, they were 136. In 1986, there were 230. Just to end there. In my opinion, as I look at this, there's something that happened in, at least between 1976 and 1983. After 1983, the MK's operations ascended dramatically. I attribute this to a number of factors. In 1983, the ANC took the decision to do away with the old Revolutionary Council and establish the Political Military Council, the PMC. The main task of the PMC and its difference with the old Revolutionary Council was that it would be able to integrate political and military structures, house them in the same structure, encourage coordination and cooperation. It is at this moment, 1984 now, that the Mkhonto Sizwe's military headquarters adopt a new approach to the armed struggle. This new approach, which Kabwe the next year endorses, says that MK combatants are going to, from that moment on, be infiltrated inside the country for the main purpose of recruiting personnel from inside the country. That personnel that, in the words of the Green Book, had been thrown up into the open as a result of their experiences in the mass democratic movement and their daily struggles against apartheid. As I'm saying, Kabwe endorses this approach. So these people coming inside the country, they would train local people who had never left the country, they would train them inside, arm them, conduct small operations. And this saying, the military headquarters has the view, projection that this all would build towards an armed insurrection. There is a kind of technical disclaimer in the Green Book, a disclaimer to the armed struggle, in the sense that says, the Green Book emphasizes the primacy of the political struggle. In other words, the ANC by that time, 1978, 79, no longer had the expectation of armed seizure of power in that way, where that term perhaps would be placing the armed struggle at the forefront. Now the ANC's emphasis was on mass political mobilization, and I just needed to raise that so that we understand that also this is the thinking that is in the mass democratic movement. The people that connect, that become the reception committees, groups, to this horde of MK people that are being sent inside the country at this moment as a result of this. And this is the basis that they're working from. There is evidence that this approach, the new approach, was starting to work, did work. Evidence from Sheligan in their work, Voices from the Underground, Hassan Ibrahim from Marabastad to Mogadishu, also Mangashe's Operation Zikomo. And it is important to note here that at this moment, there is also, from 1984-85 onwards, there is an improved rate of survival of MK cadres inside. General Herman Stadler, in his own words, General Stadler was head of the South African Police Intelligence Division. In his own words, he says, from September 1984, the ANC were able to send in more people because of the unrest. I'm not trying to blend this to show how the leadership of the United Democratic Front were able to bring in these strands of people into the mainstream to ensure that from the local level, mass daily struggles occur. We're able to achieve a situation where there is political ferment inside the country. A lot more people are now organized than ever before. And so this creates a conducive environment, and it builds in a situation where people are able to participate in the, General Stadler says earlier that Black people have no experience in war. But now in this moment, I have the feeling that they're improving, because for the first time, yes, now they're improving. They're involved in modern war, and in my opinion, they are succeeding in at least learning. And here I'm being humble. I need to add also that from 1987, MK started to send people, small batches of their combatants, for further training in different arms, more conventional, in the Navy, in the Air Force, in conventional infantry. These groups were groups that were meant at further reinforcing the armed effort later.
Sorry, Patrick. Please, I think we're quickly running out of time, so could you please wind up?
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, it's fine. In winding up, then I needed to make the restatement that the United Democratic Front created the impetus that ensured that the ANC's armed struggle, the negotiations period came in. The UDF brought in numbers of people in these 5 strands: the youth, the students, the women, trade union movement, the civics. These strands ensured that the UDF was able to bring in much more people than in any other political formation, protest political formation in South Africa, I venture. Better than the defense campaign in the 1952 defense campaign in their approach. They achieved a wider geographic spread in their campaigns. They deepened non-racialism. They found alternatives to undemocratic structures, people's courts, people's police. They did away with crime, and most people that one has spoken to says so. We also saw the lessons of the Mandela United Football Club episode, where the UDF strengthened the belief in the cause, that the cause mattered over personalities and other considerations. It freed the nation from being held or ransomed by individuals or any other considerations. The cause of the people is to them supreme. The UDF had no charismatic leader, but was united by common principles in which all believed and to which all adhered. The cult of personality was minimized. I have also the feeling that, because the other part that the ANC delegation took back from the Vietnamese in their visit was to bring back what was called the 5 fighting factors. But Tabiso, if you give me another chance, next time I'll deal with the 5 fighting factors and the South African situation.
Oh, okay, hopefully you get the chance to address them when it comes to questions and comments. Okay, thank you, Patrick, for that very informative piece of history on the UDF and the armed struggle. So now we'll take questions and comments. So like we normally do, each round will be comprised of 3 questions or comments, and you can make use of the chat section, or you can use the hand raising feature to raise your hand, and then we can give you the chance to speak. So if an individual has 3 questions, that will also be a round on its own. So I guess I'll start whilst we're waiting for these questions and comments. I know, and I read your paper, and I understand it was long, and that's why we had to go a bit overboard with the time. But I wanted to quickly get your, I wanted to know more about women, the women's role in the UDF, particularly within the UDF. What roles did they play, and who were these individuals? Yeah, thank you. Oh yes, there's a question from Prof. Sikiba Kiba. Yes, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thanks very much, Tabiso, and good afternoon, Patrick. Good to see you. And thank you so much for a fascinating presentation. I think a lot has actually been written about the UDF. You know, and the literature you do cite, for example, Jeremy Sickings, you cite Ineke van Kessel, you cite other scholars, some of whom have actually published in the series on Cited. So the question that I would like to ask really is, what are you contributing to the literature here? What is your unique contribution to the literature, seeing as it is that the UDF has actually been written about? So that's my first question. The second question, very briefly, is, you know, you talk about mass mobilization in the armed struggle, and I just want to ask the question, what the role of the media was in this mobilization. You have referred to some of these people working in the underground, that they were listening to Radio Freedom, among other media that they were exposed to. But I wonder if you could talk more around the issue of the issue of media and how it was utilized, you know, within this process of mass mobilization, within the UDF itself, but also the ANC underground. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for those 2 questions, Prof. Sikiba Kiba. So Patrick, I think my small question, and these 2 questions will make this round, so you have a chance to respond to them now, and then we'll take the next round after you've responded to these. Thank you.
Thanks, Tabiso. On your question on the women's role in the United Democratic Front. As I mentioned, but I think in passing, the women as a group, as a strata, made part of the 5 main strands of UDF organization. And thus this organization had its background, the attempt by Albertina Sisulu, Jesse Duarte, and others to revive the old FEDSO. They could not, and they actually opted for regionally based women's organization. When the UDF came in, what occurred is, first and foremost, it became difficult for a single UDF women's organization to be formed. This took time. It was formed. It was able to be established later. So in the different regions, there was UDF organization. And also talking about women's role in the UDF, and you find that, for instance, in these 5 strands, in the youth, students, trade union movement, in the civics. In all of these, there is a possibility that women would be there as part of the youth, the women, the students, trade union movement, civics. One of the main principles, important principles of the United Democratic Front was non-sexism. And one's feeling that that was practiced. Other women also were appeared from the national leadership of the UDF. Albertina Sulu was, for instance, part of the women that were there, Jesse Duarte, Sherry Caronas. Well, a lot of women now that don't come into mind were in the leadership of the United Democratic Front. And also that women's issues in themselves were taken up by the United Democratic Front in both the general level and in the women's groups. Hope I've done some justice to this one. Professor Skiba, unique contribution. What's my unique contribution to the literature? My unique contribution to the literature is that the ANC's armed struggle was given impetus by the United Democratic Front's mobilization efforts. I don't remember anyone saying that before. I feel that's my contribution to literature. And this is my thesis. And all of the work that I'm doing is towards proving that. That's the first one. Media contribution, as you say, I've mentioned Radio Freedom, but in the United Democratic Front itself, media was used a lot. In fact, the UDF used very modern methods of media to communicate with these people. Van Kessel mentions grassroots, and apart, for instance, grassroots is a community newspaper, which spawned other community newspapers in the whole of the Western Cape. SASPU, which was a students' organ. The UDF itself had Nation, Isizwe as media platforms, as newspapers, newsletters. It had a number of them that would focus on different issues, whilst others would be agitators, others would be informative, etc. But I couldn't have enough time to fit all this into a single presentation. Thanks, Abis.
Okay, thank you, Patrick, for that responses or for those responses. So unless I don't know, I hope Prof. Sekiba, I hope you are answered there. So we will take another round of questions and comments. And also just to remind the audience that you're free to use the chat section. If you put your comment or question there, I'll then read it out for Patrick and then for all of us to be together. There's a hand from Kasonde. Yes, Kasonde, please go ahead and ask your question or raise your comment.
Thanks, Tabisa. Very interesting presentation, Patrick. My question really isn't about your sort of main thesis. A smaller question. I'm interested in the role of the Catholic Church. You sort of mentioned it that many of the youth who are conscientized to join COSAS had been through youth groups, religious groups in the Catholic Church. Is there anything in particular about the Catholic Church in South Africa at that time that led it to conscientize people? Because I mean, the main religious people in UDF, if I'm not mistaken, Reverend Beas Naudé and others were actually from Dutch Reformed. So that's my just small question. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Yes. And then there's another question or comment. There's a hand from Prof. Noor. Yes, Prof. Please go ahead and.
Thanks, Thabisa, and thank you, Patrick. Patrick, I mean, this is all very interesting, and as I understand it, this is, you know, the kind of core argument of your PhD. And so, you know, one is looking forward to the kind of further research you're going to do. And I'm hoping that you get from this seminar strong encouragement for the kind of line of research and arguments that you're developing. I've got kind of 2, maybe 3 questions, comments. The first one is, it's not clear to me why you want to focus on the UDFs. And it's kind of linked to Sikiba's question. And you're saying that, you know, what is new about what you are claiming and arguing is the way that the UDF created the space for the, you know, development, acceleration of the arms struggle. You know, so it doesn't seem to me that in that statement that is much that's new about the UDF. And then it raises the question, you know, why the focus on the UDF? I mean, there's no doubt that the UDF played a key role, although I think that you tend to exaggerate the successes of the UDF. And that, for example, comes out in the way that you assess the Million Signature campaign, which was a failure. You know, it is true that the Million Signature campaign meant that activists, where I was in the Cape Youth Congress, etc., went house to house. But in fact, the Million Signature campaign did not initiate that kind of activity. That was done well before and well after the Million Signature campaign. So I want to urge a more kind of critical reflection of this history. The next issue is really about, you know, it seems to me that, you know, again, there's no doubt that the internal arms struggle, you know, gained momentum from the 1980s. And there's, you know, ample evidence, and people have kind of written about this, about how in different areas, in townships and elsewhere, in the rural areas, there's clear evidence. And of course, the increase in the internal struggle played a fundamental role in that. But I'm not sure that one can confine it to the role of the UDF. The struggles that exploded in the 1980s, went well beyond the UDF, and that's not to discount the importance of the UDF. The kind of trade union movement, for example, right? The struggles in the rural areas, etc., etc. These all contributed to creating conditions in which the various aspects of the liberation movement, gained momentum, including the armed struggle. So it's not entirely clear to me, why the specific focus on the UDF. I wonder whether your inquiry wouldn't, if it was not more focused, say, for example, on particular elements in the UDF, such as COSAS, such as PSYCO, the youth congresses, and maybe some of the trade unions, for example, SAWHU, as opposed to those trade unions that were amalgamated into FOSATU, whether that wouldn't give us better insight into how those organizations and their particular struggles contributed to the armed struggle. And this is my final point, which I'd like you to comment on, how the development of the internal armed struggle affected mass mobilization. Because that's not a straightforward question. There are at least two opposing views about it. One of which is that the expansion of the armed struggle, in fact, had a negative effect on mass mobilization, and in fact contributed, therefore, to the ANC leadership's drive towards a negotiated settlement. Thanks.
Okay, I think that was quite detailed comments and questions from Noor. So, Ariana, may I ask that I take your questions and comments in the next round, and then we allow Patrick to respond to these one question and two questions from Prof. Noor. Okay, thank you. So over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Thabiso, and thanks for the questions. Kasonda, your question on the role of the Catholic Church and why is it that it seems that I would have highlighted the role of the Catholic Church, and particularly, I'm not doing that. I actually going out of my way to record reality, first and foremost. And what I've seen is, for instance, a lot of COSAS people, that led COSAS, that were leading activists of COSAS. Almost all of them have their roots, their background in the Catholic Church. The young Christian worker, and they were molded there. Lulu Johnson, Elijah Masina, Shepherd Marty, Jonas Ngobo. You could, in my opinion, ask, in fact, who during that time, COSAS leadership were not from the Catholic Church. In other words, the Catholic Church and its youth programs, I think, were able to catch into their net and educate a lot of the youth who later joined the struggle for liberation. I'm not at all playing down the role of the other churches. Professor Noor, the Million Signatures campaign, I want to make a comment as a response, not to a single of your questions, but a kind of overall broad comment. The first part is, it has become difficult. This presentation and this paper leaves out some small detail. Leaves out the detail. It is a kind of broad stroke presentation, as there are things that do not appear here. For instance, if one may start down here with trade union struggles, and you're mentioning that it doesn't seem I'm giving any credence to work that was done by unions such as the South African Allied Workers Union, which I do in the actual research, in the actual text. But this has had to be narrowed down, because that would otherwise have taken a lot more time. I think I mentioned SAU in the Whitson Roundtree strike, for instance. The kind of union that SAU is or was non-registered and read, and so would have, in my opinion, been the detail that is otherwise in the main text. Why do I confine the armed struggle and the role of the UDF in it? And why is it that I would actually highlight the role of the UDF in giving impetus to the struggle and take the UDF alone and not include others? My feeling is that the United Democratic Front actually, more than any other organization, political body in the 80s, from, as I'm saying, from when it was formed, because of the numbers that it brought in. That's my first argument. The numbers that it brought in, the depth of organization, geographic spread, ensured that the UDF, in my opinion, the way I look at it, stamped its place as the most wide organization, political organization in the extra parliamentary opposition in South Africa that ever was. Once again, my emphasis is in the numbers, is in the depth of the UDF, which is why I see that the difference, which I'm saying the other factors do not in their own contribute or contributed at that time to the struggle, to the armed struggle, to the improvement of the armed struggle. But what I see, is that the UDF became, in my opinion, the main activist group that paved the way for the armed struggle. And I may add here, apart from the numbers and political depth, I may add, yes, their political line, the clarity in their political line. And I try to build their roots from the late 70s to the 80s. Where did they come from? Why is it that they became a bigger body in society than any other? You would find them in Limpopo, then in the Transvaal, you would find them in the Eastern Cape, in the Western Cape, you would find them everywhere. I'm not discounting the contribution of other factors and other political bodies. But I'm merely saying the UDF put its stamp on history. I actually wasn't sure on how, on what your meaning would have been on that the expansion of the armed struggle affected mass mobilization. I would have thought that the expansion of the armed struggle would have affected mass mobilization positively. That's the first part. It would have encouraged people, given them the strength of knowing that there's a new situation that's developing, where members of Mkhonto Sizwe, for instance, are carrying out operations, and we're not seeing them being captured, killed more often than was the case before the improvement of the armed struggles and its possibilities. That's the first part. I would have hoped that in that situation, then the armed struggle would have positively contributed to mass mobilization, brought much more people into the mass mobilization net. And in mass mobilization and negotiations, Prof, I'm sorry, I actually didn't get that, because I got the impression that you meant that negotiations, your last words were, which is why the ANC opted for negotiations. So the impression that I'm left with is that negotiations were not a good thing. I'm sorry, Prof, but I didn't actually grasp that. Thanks, Tabiso.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. Ariana, I don't know, your hand was up and then all of a sudden I don't see it. I think we've still got a couple of minutes really we can squeeze in and take your question or comment, and that will be round on its own. And then after that, Patrick, and then after Ariana, Patrick, you can maybe, if you have any closing remarks that you wish to say, and then I'll afford you that space. And then also there's, okay, sorry, Ariana, I just saw another comment from Joku here in the chat section. So Joku says, hi, Patrick, thanks for the paper and presentation. In similar lines to others, could you perhaps say in simple terms, what is the question that you're probing in your research? This is not clear to me. Is it something like what explains the 1980s upsurge of armed struggle? So this question and Ariana's comment or question will make up this last round. Then after that, I'll allow you to if you have any closing remarks to address those. Okay, over to you, Ariana.
Thanks, Tabiso. Thanks, Patrick, for the very clear political analysis of a very complex period. We were chatting just before the seminar formally started about a PhD proposal presentation that many of us in the history workshop and the history department participated in yesterday on the history of COSAS, which features also in your presentation. And I wanted to ask you a question around what the if you could speak about the role of COSAS or the relationship between COSAS and the intensification of the armed struggle in the late 1980s. And vice versa, and this goes back to, I guess, Noor's question about the impact of the armed struggle on mass mobilization, which you see as generally a positive one. But I suppose what Noor was hinting at, or something that came up in yesterday's presentation as well, is the issue of kind of militarization and what that means for kind of democratic participatory struggles. Yeah, I'll leave it like that because I know we're running out of time. I also wanted to ask you about the recruiting, the recruitment of women in this last phase of the armed struggle of insurrectionary politics and armed struggle, and the recruitment of women. But I don't know if you're going to have time to address that. Thanks.
Thanks, Ariana. Thanks, Tabiso. The role of COSAS in brief in the armed struggle. I regard the role of COSAS in the armed struggle as having been the most important, in the sense that COSAS provided the armed struggle with its personnel. Those people who did things, who bore arms, who gave of themselves, were members of COSAS in the 80s. Just an example now, in the Transkei in the year 1981, 20 students left for Lesotho to join Mkondo Wesizwe, 20 that at the same time, and that with their names known, as just a single example. And COSAS made a lot of effort in explaining to the youth the role of MK, the role of armed struggle, why the armed struggle. In their workshops, they would do that, talking to people who were in the leadership of COSAS. And yes, COSAS' contribution was extremely great in the armed struggle. And then as far as armed struggle and militarization, if we are saying that the armed struggle as having been the preserve of Mkhonto Wesizwe as a military organization, and we're saying the armed struggle was responsible for the militarization and of communities. I would promptly differ with that. My argument would be first and foremost that militarization or the worship of violence was brought into the equation mainly by the violence of apartheid, the violence of the system itself. I do not think that had the system not been violent, then the people would have even thought of violence. The reason why Mkhonto Wesizwe would have been, and the armed struggle would have been worshipped in the townships with kids holding wooden guns, singing about Joslovo, Chris Hani, etc., was because of, as a response to apartheid violence. They needed a kind of protection. And Mkhonto Wesizwe provided that. They'd seen or heard of Mkhonto Wesizwe people, members, giving of their lives, bearing arms, bombs exploding. So they would, yes, attribute that to them and would aspire also to become part of it. But I differ that you would actually say that the more people were trained by Mkhonto Wesizwe in the underground, the more they became militarized. And this is because the MK's militarization, the one that I'm talking about, where UDF regional structures were reception committees of MK cadres coming from outside, is disciplined, organized, disciplined violence, if I may say that. It is not the kind of militarization that you're talking about. Now, militarization where there's rogue elements in society or conduct antisocial acts, perhaps. I argue that you wouldn't attribute that to the armed struggle and to the way in which Mkhonto Wesizwe took people in, trained them. I would dare say, in fact, that because the military tends not to allow individual people to express themselves, that and more a compartmentalization of ideas and towards obedience, because this is necessary in the context of the military environment. I would argue that you would have had much more disciplined people. Those people that were drawn into Mkhonto Wesizwe, in my opinion, were people that people that were compelled to be disciplined. They were taught discipline. Had they not been disciplined, the military environment does not allow people like that to survive in there. So I really do not understand why the armed struggle will be blamed for a breakdown in discipline and for a kind of militarization. I do not understand the kind of militarization that is being referred to. Njogu, this question, my thesis, yes, I agree with part of what you're saying. What explains the 1980s upsurge of the armed struggle? Yes, I agree to that it can be framed also in that way. It seems strange to other people why this kind of work would be chosen and done. Where does it come from? It comes from the fact that literature today is fraught with a struggle, none of which, in my opinion, or there's a very small part that does any accuracy as reflecting reality, which is why I thought my thesis would contribute towards clarification of such issues. Why do I emphasize on the United Democratic Front, even though it has been written about? The difference is I'm writing about the United Democratic Front in relationship to the armed struggle. I'm linking the United Democratic Front with the armed struggle. And this is what I'm doing. Njogu, I do not know, I hope I've tried to
Okay.
thanks.
Thank you, Patrick. Okay, I'll just take this one last question, and because it would be an injustice to leave it hanging like that. So there's a question from Emmanuel.
Yes.
So I'll just quickly go to the question. So the question is, why did MK abandon their intelligence after the negotiations? So I think that will be our last question and comment for this session. Thank you. Over to you, Patrick.
Yeah, my response to that, Tabiso, is remember that there was a negotiations process. And in that negotiations process, there were certain issues that were agreed upon. And part of these were to say, in as far as the military structures and intelligence structures are concerned, they are military structures, intelligence structures are integrating. So no other military structures or intelligence structures would exist after that. In fact, the Intelligence Act, for instance, outlaws the existence of any other intelligence organizations in the country. And so the ANC had to, I don't know if the word is correct to say abandon, because no one was abandoned in terms of the personnel. The personnel integrated onto the bigger country's structure. So I wouldn't use the word abandoned really. Thanks, Travis.
Okay. I think we've come to the end of our session. We've had to go overboard a bit because that was quite a detailed presentation. But I have a few comments, a few closing remarks to make myself. So, this conversation can continue and must continue. So what will happen is a video of this will be uploaded on our YouTube channel, which is the History Workshop, or you can access it via, there'll be links that will be posted on our social media pages. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel while you're at it. And also this is our last webinar in this first half of the year, or this first semester. We'll be back in August when the second semester commences. Okay, and so thank you, and have a good day.
Thanks, Chief.
Thanks, Patrick. Nice to see you. We must catch up soon.
Yes. Please, Ariana. Thanks again.
I'll make a plan to call you next week. Let's be in touch.
Okay. Thank you.
Bye. Take care.
Sure. Tabiso, thanks.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks very much, Patrick. And thanks, Tabiso. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.